So my name is Julius. I'm an editor. And so my job is not only to look at ideas, but to look how to edit them. Because the thing is that we have so many of them. Like we go every day through all the possibilities, all the media, all the resources, all the information that we receive from everywhere. And then, you know, we can get confused because we just have too much. And one of the things that we think about our brains, and I think we're going to listen a lot to how we think and how we do things, is our brain as, you know, information processing machines. The brain is incredible, and it has exercised an incredible, you know, mystery in our history. A history to the point that, you know, we developed illustrations like that. This is from 1883 to describe phrenology, which is now a defunct, you know, science that kind of said that the brain was divided in parts, and these parts, they had, you know, specific things that they were supposed to do. And we know that the brain is much more complex today. You know, the brain is connected, and if we're doing one thing on one side, it's also connected to the other side. If we have, you know, words that we listen, you know, this is experienced in many parts of the brain. We have parts of the brain that are more specific to certain things, but the brain is definitely a web of connection of things. And after phrenology, you know, I always have to think, you know, how we deal with all this information these days. So this is pretty much like how the difference between like 50 years ago and these days. You know, we used to have like a few things that to deal with. We had basically 50 years ago, 60 years ago, like newspaper and radio, magazines, TV stations, and a couple other things. And this was pretty much what we had. So if you were producing content, if you were producing information, you had some possibilities to distribute them. So these were basically the publishers, the TV stations, the publishers of magazines, the radio stations, and so on and so forth. What happened in the last 80 years, or 50 years, or if you take even like the last 30 years, is that we have widened the possibilities of producing content. With that, we have also widened the possibilities of distributing everything that we produce. And then below that, you have a much, much wider possibility to consume. So that's why much more people have now access to information. And so this is another image from a Dutch illustrator that opened brains. Jan van der Laar, he did that in the 1750s, more or less. And this is basically, again, this kind of mystery, how people think so much about how we are so intrigued by the brain. And after that, what I wanted to talk to you today about is how the brain of the editor works. And it might not work in a general, very different way, but we have frameworks and we have things that we use, tools that we use to make our lives easier, but also to make your lives easier, so that when you have to find information, when you have to deal with information, meaning basically listen to good stories, find good stories. This was done in a way that it makes things simpler. Not simplistic, but simpler. And I can't stop thinking about what we're made of. And I think we're made of, you know, genes. We have our biological tendencies. We have, you know, possibilities within ourselves. Then we have interaction. You know, we grow up, we go to a certain school, we grow up in a specific city, or we travel, or we don't. We have our families, friends, and that makes a huge difference in our upbringing, you know, what we become. But this is what we're made of. And then we have chance outcome. Chance outcome is a concept that I've taken from Murray Gell-Mann when he was doing a TED Talk in 2007 in California. And then he was talking about, you know, we have some sort of accidents in our lives. And I'll give you a very simple example. When I was 9, my father was driving with 4 kids, and we had a car accident, and it was horrible. He slept. We were coming back from a kayaking competition, and the car turned to the other side, on the other part of the road, in a very busy road. But nothing happened to anyone. Nothing happened. It was somehow a miracle. But we can only imagine what our lives would have been if just one person had died. It could have been me, it could have been my brother, we had a friend with us, it could have been only my father. He was, at the end, he was driving, but nothing happened to anyone. But just to think about what could have happened, it makes a huge difference. So our life is also determined, in a sense, by these chance outcomes, by these accidents. They can change the course of everything. And I take that in account, because this is when you're telling a story to someone. You want to think that something in that story can change people's lives as well, the way you tell them and what you tell them. The other thing is that how we evolve. And like pretty much what I said, we evolve biologically, we evolve socially, but we also evolve technologically. Technology makes a huge difference. In technology, we're not talking about just the computer or the mobile phone or just the remote control that I'm using right now. We're talking about the chair, we're talking about fire, we're talking about like very simple things that change our lives. And I think there's a cycle. So it's So we've seen, I think there's a correlation between all these 3 things. Because, for example, let's take the antibiotics as an example. So it's a technological piece. We created that because we have diseases that need antibiotics to be cured of. But the moment where we use antibiotics, these changes our social life, that in turn, but that also changes our genetics, because we know we're getting resistance now. So we're becoming resistant to antibiotics. So there's a huge interaction between our genetics, our social lives, and technology. When I think about editing, there's one thing that comes first to me. And this thing is actually, curiously enough, it was developed by the founder of TED. In the 80s, Richard Sorwerman, he created this theory called LATCH. L-A-T-C-H. And LATCH is basically a theory of how to organize information. There are 5 ways to do that. One is you do by location. So we have maps, for example, that we created over time. The second thing is alphabetical. So we, in different alphabets, in different languages, we have alphabetical order. The other thing is time. So we use time as a basis. So we have timelines, and we tell stories chronologically. So there's a narrative that we use very frequently. There's also category. So we categorize things by color, for example. This is a category. And also there's hierarchy, something is more important than other things. So what we do many times when we're editing is that we combine. So this is a very useful tool that we can use on a daily basis. There's no, actually, this is not restricted to, for working on TV, or if you're doing an article or writing something for a newspaper or magazine. The other thing that I use very frequently is something that I call the 30-30-40. And this is, I ironically call it the first law of Julius, because I want to be famous with that one day. But it's, I think it's a way to frame the stories that we tell in a very simple way. When you're telling the story, what you're trying to do is trying to engage with someone, create some, identify with something, with whatever it is, and then take this person to another place, which is the place where this person is learning something. Because nothing, we want, and I think we should, make people's time as useful as we can, especially today, that there's so much. I always joke that, we don't have a little bit of everything, we have a lot of everything these days. And 30-30-40 is pretty much these. The first 30% that we should worry about is to use something that will put people in a comfort zone. So you bring them to you by creating this comfort zone. The second thing that we should look at immediately is the curiosity zone. So you're giving people something that they know slightly, they know a little bit about it, but they want to know more. They feel that, there's something more to it. And then there's the last thing, which is the most important of all, which is education. It's getting people to learn something, people to leave the place where they are, and they'll say, wow, now I learned something. And we can always do that. If we try to frame the storytelling process into these three things, it's a really good way to get people from a place that they are comfortable with something to a place that they might actually be very uncomfortable at the end, but even so, they will have learned something that they didn't know before. And that's what we have to do every day, especially now that technology and communication changes so fast. We want to learn, we need to. So one of the last things that I always think about as well is to focus. So how to focus to tell a story, how to focus to edit things. And it's reduce, prioritize, and simplify. And why that? Because we reduce by similarity, You have a lot. So we do visual books. And I have to, at the end, edit things down to maybe 3%, 5% of what I had at the beginning. So this huge amount of things, how do I do that? So I start reducing by similarity. I get things that are similar, so okay, I don't need that, this is repetition, so you look at repetition. So the second thing is to prioritize. And how you do that? You do that by looking at the principles. So what are the principles that make the difference in the story that I'm telling? So now I'm not only looking at similarity, I'm looking at principles. And the last thing is to simplify. And again, it's not to make it simplistic, but it's to make it simple. Simple enough that people understand a lot. And you do that by looking at the essence of things. We really want to go to the essence, to the bottom of everything. And then there's one last concept that we heard before today about quality. And I have my own, kind of the pillars of quality that I try to work with. And the three pillars is innovation, is execution, is longevity. So innovation is like I give people something new. I want people to look at the stuff that I've done, going after during all the process of editing. And I want them to look at that and say, wow, this is something really interesting. I haven't seen these exactly before. And then the second thing is execution. How many times we've all seen here great ideas that were killed by bad execution. How many times we've seen that over and over, and we still see that every day. People tell me, oh, the internet has a lot of shit. And I say, wow, really? Go to the newsstand. Not only they had the idea, they printed. And this is execution. This is really spending resources that you wouldn't like to. And then there's longevity. I truly believe that if we're doing something that has value, it has value because it lasts. It lasts really long. I'm doing something that I want to get a book in 20 years. I may even identify that this book is from the 80s, the 70s, or let's say from 2017, for that sake, as we are in this year. But I want to look at this 30 years after that and say, wow, this still has value. It holds value. And I think that's longevity. So this is, pretty much, I think, today the way I try to frame the work that I do. But I think these concepts, they also have an incredible potential to serve in our daily lives, everything we do. It might be you're organizing your kitchen, or, you're making the list for a dinner with friends, or if you're just trying to educate yourself on something. And editing, reducing to the essence, I think it's a fundamental thing today, as we have so much to deal with. So it's necessary. Thank you very much.